Heat clung to the air like a heavy blanket. The base gym smelled of rubber mats, stale sweat, and old canvas. Boots squeaked against the floor. Low murmurs rolled through the space as sailors finished stretching, adjusting gloves, tightening wraps. A loose circle began to form without anyone being told. Lieutenant Mark Harlan stepped into the center of it. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he owned the space. His eyes landed on Petty Officer Elena Cross. He looked her up and down once, then again. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Every unit ends up with liabilities, people who look good on paperwork but don't belong on a real battlefield." A few sailors shifted their weight. Harlan took a step closer to Elena. "Paperwork sailors," he continued. "The kind that exist because someone had to fill a slot." A soft chuckle slipped from somewhere in the circle. Another followed. Harlan's mouth curved into a thin smile. Elena did not move. Her boots stayed planted. Her eyes remained forward. Her hands hung relaxed at her sides. No argument. No explanation. No protest. Harlan circled her slowly. "You know the type," he said. "Never fired a shot in anger. Never been in a real fight. But somehow they end up standing in rooms like this." More quiet laughter. The circle tightened. Elena's breathing stayed slow. Even. Controlled. Harlan stopped in front of her. "Perfect," he said. "You'll do." He glanced at the crowd. "We're going to use Petty Officer Cross as a demonstration prop." His smirk widened. "Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to FOB Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?" Petty Officer Elena Cross was in her late 20s, but the way she carried herself made her feel older than her age. On paper, she was assigned to logistics support. That was the label in the roster, and the reason most of the base barely noticed her until she was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Logistics meant supply runs, inventory counts, signing forms, lifting crates, and disappearing into hallways while louder people took credit for the mission. Elena did all of it without complaint. Her gear was always immaculate. Boots clean. Uniform pressed. No loose threads. No sloppy straps. Even her water bottle looked like it had never been dropped. The kind of detail most people only managed when someone important was watching. Elena lived that way even when nobody was. She was always early too. Not 5 minutes early, but the kind of early that made others uncomfortable. She would be there before the doors opened, standing slightly off to the side, quiet and patient, as if waiting had been drilled into her bones. And when people spoke to her, she answered with the bare minimum. "Yes, sir." "No, ma'am." Understood. That was it. The base had a way of interpreting silence as emptiness, so they filled it with their assumptions. "Too calm," they said, like nothing bothered her. "Too small," they whispered, like she was a mistake someone forgot to correct. "Too quiet," they laughed, like she was scared. The truth was, Elena didn't give them anything to hold on to. No drama. No stories. No desperate explanations about why she belonged. That made her an easy target, because the easiest person to mock is the one who won't defend themselves in front of an audience. Over the past few weeks, the humiliations had been small but steady. She got stuck with the supply runs nobody wanted, carrying crates across the base while others walked past with hands in pockets. She would step aside for groups moving fast, pressed against walls, eyes down, letting them pass like she was furniture. During drills, she was told to observe, not participate. "Just watch," one instructor had said, not even looking at her. "This is for people who might actually need it." She stood at the edge of the formation and watched. Not offended, not embarrassed. Just watching. In the chow line, she was ignored unless someone needed something. In the hallways, she heard the jokes. Logistics queen. Paper sailor. Probably here to check boxes. She never turned her head. It wasn't that she didn't feel it. It was that her face never gave permission for anyone to see it. Elena had a habit that most people didn't notice unless they watched her closely. When a room grew loud, when voices rose, when tension thickened, she would slow her breathing without thinking about it. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A measured rhythm that never changed, no matter what was said around her. It wasn't calming. It was controlling. And sometimes, when she entered a space, her eyes didn't scan faces the way most people did. They scanned corners, exits, angles, where a threat could come from, where a body could move, what could be used, what could be blocked, what could be avoided. It was the kind of habit that didn't come from shyness. It came from repetition. There were other small signs. The way her fingers flexed once, lightly, before she lifted anything heavy, like a reset button. The way she stood with her weight balanced, not relaxed, but ready. The way her gaze tracked movement instead of people, as if bodies were geometry, not personalities. And beneath all of it was that calm, not timid calm, trained calm. Like someone who had already been yelled at by better voices than the ones on this base, already been tested by harder hands, already learned that emotion was something you managed in private, not something you performed in public. There was a faint old scar near her jawline, just along the edge where the skin should have been smooth. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fresh. It looked like it belonged to another life entirely, the kind of mark you stopped noticing unless the light hit it just right. Nobody asked about it. Nobody wanted the answer. Because answers meant she might be real, and the base had already decided what she was. The gym was where those decisions became loudest. The combative's floor wasn't just a place to train. It was a stage. Rank mattered there in a way it didn't in paperwork offices or supply rooms. Whoever wore authority could turn the whole space into a courtroom. The circle of sailors became the jury, and laughter became a verdict. In that room, voice carried weight. Confidence passed as competence. And silence, in their minds, meant weakness. So when Lieutenant Mark Harlan began to circle Elena Cross, speaking about liabilities and standards like he was preaching, the crowd didn't see an underdog being targeted. They saw a quiet person standing alone. And they assumed, like people always do, that quiet meant she had nothing to offer. Elena didn't correct them. She just stood there, eyes forward, breathing steady, as if she had survived worse rooms than this one. And that was the part they didn't understand yet. They thought the gym belonged to the loudest man in it. They didn't know. It only takes one moment for a room to learn who it truly belongs to. Lieutenant Mark Harlan loved the sound of his own certainty. He stood with his hands on his hips, chin lifted, as if the whole room had been built for him. The circle of sailors watched the way young men always watch rank, half fearful, half hungry for approval. Harlan fed on it without even trying to hide it. "This isn't a dojo," he said, voice carrying across the mats. "This isn't a sport. Out there, nobody cares if you feel offended. Nobody cares if you think something is unfair." He paced a slow line, boots squeaking, eyes cutting through the crowd as if he was measuring who would survive and who would fold. "Out there," he continued, tapping his knuckles against his palm, "you either adapt or you die. That's battlefield survival. That's what separates professionals from tourists." A few sailors nodded hard, eager to belong to the right side of his sentence. Harlan's gaze returned to Elena Cross like a magnet. "And that," he said, pointing at her without touching her, "is exactly why we're going to do a demonstration." He took a breath like he was about to gift them something. "Escape from a larger attacker," he announced. "A basic concept. Simple. The kind of thing that keeps you alive when your weapon is gone and your hands are all you have left." The circle tightened slightly. A few sailors leaned forward. Harlan's smile sharpened. "And since this is about reality," he said, "we need a realistic example." His eyes stayed on Elena. He walked toward her like the decision had been made long ago. Elena didn't move. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward. She stayed where she was, eyes forward, shoulders neutral, hands relaxed. Harlan reached out and grabbed her wrist, not the firm, controlled grip of a safe demonstration. Tighter than necessary. Possessive. His fingers dug in enough that the skin around them paled. He twisted slightly, just a fraction, enough to create discomfort without leaving an obvious mark. A few sailors noticed. One of them shifted awkwardly, as if the room had suddenly turned colder. Harlan spoke while holding her, voice loud and easy. "This is biology," he said. "This is physics. A larger, stronger attacker has advantages you cannot talk your way out of." He lifted Elena's wrist higher like he was presenting evidence to a jury. "Grip strength matters. Mass matters. Bone density matters. That's not sexism, that's reality." A couple of nervous laughs spilled out, thin and unsure. Harlan laughed with them, but his laugh wasn't nervous. It was proud. Elena did not react. No flinch. No visible discomfort. No tightening of her jaw. Just stillness. Harlan glanced at her face as if he expected to find fear there, something he could point at and call proof. He found nothing. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then he spoke again, louder, as if volume could replace the control he felt slipping. "Watch closely," he told the crowd. "Because this is what happens when someone who doesn't belong ends up in the wrong place." He shoved her shoulder, not hard enough to call it an attack. Hard enough to test her balance. Elena's body shifted less than an inch. Her feet stayed planted. Her posture remained upright. It wasn't stubbornness. It was stability. Harlan blinked once, then covered it with a grin. "Lucky stance," he said. He adjusted his feet, trying to regain the narrative, then lifted his free hand. He started with slow mock strikes toward her face. They weren't meant to land. They were meant to intimidate. The kind of fake aggression that makes people shrink, makes them raise their hands too late, makes them panic. Elena's response was almost invisible. A slight tilt of her head, a shift of her shoulder. A small step that wasn't really a step, more like a relocation of weight. Inches. Nothing dramatic. No fear. No retreat. The crowd chuckled at first, expecting her to crack, expecting the show to end with her embarrassed and him victorious. But the laughter didn't grow. It thinned. Because Elena didn't perform the weakness they were waiting for, Harlan threw another mock strike, closer this time. His palm stopped just short of her cheek. Elena moved a fraction, just enough to let the line of impact pass her. No wasted motion, no hands flying up, no startled breath. A sailor at the edge of the circle stopped smiling. Another lowered his arms from where they were crossed, as if he'd suddenly remembered he had a body in the room too. Harlan's eyes narrowed. He threw again, faster. This time he aimed for her nose, stopping at the last second. Elena slipped just enough that his hand cut air. The room didn't laugh. A murmur moved through them instead, quiet and uncertain. The kind of sound that happens when people realize they might have misjudged something but aren't ready to admit it yet. Harlan heard it. He felt it. His jaw tightened. He tried to smile again, but it didn't sit right on his face anymore. "You see," he said, still talking, still performing. "You don't need strength. You need timing." But his voice carried a sharper edge now, because timing was exactly what Elena was showing him. Harlan stepped in closer. He increased the speed again. Mock strike, mock strike, mock strike. Each one a little nearer. Each one testing whether she would finally break. Elena's body moved like a quiet machine. Micro slips. Small shifts. Her shoulders stayed loose. Her eyes stayed steady. She didn't track his hands like a beginner. She tracked the center of him. His hips, his weight. The source, not the noise. The circle around them went quieter with every exchange. Laughter had nowhere to land. No weakness appeared. No pleading. No apology. And suddenly the room felt like it was watching something it didn't have permission to understand. Harlan's breathing changed. He started breathing through his mouth. His shoulders rose. He was working harder now, not physically, but emotionally, trying to force a result that would protect his pride. Elena remained calm, and that calm felt like an insult. Because how do you dominate someone who refuses to look dominated? Harlan's strikes grew sharper. They weren't playful anymore. They carried frustration. And the crowd could feel that shift, even if they couldn't name it. One sailor swallowed hard. Another glanced toward the doors as if hoping someone would walk in and end this before it got worse. Would you have spoken up in that moment? Would you have stepped into that circle, between rank and cruelty, and risked becoming the next target? Or would you have stayed quiet, the way most people stay quiet when authority turns ugly? Harlan threw another strike, close enough that it brushed air along Elena's cheek. Still no counter. Still no big move. Still no emotion. Harlan paused, just for a beat. His eyes flicked around the circle, searching for laughter, searching for confirmation that he was still the one in control. He didn't find it. He found silence. He found faces that no longer looked entertained. He found uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to a man who needs to be seen as untouchable. So Harlan tightened his grip on Elena's wrist, harder. The twist became sharper. This time the discomfort was visible in the way her skin pulled under his fingers, in the way the tendons at her wrist stood out. A sailor in the circle frowned. Another's eyes widened slightly. Harlan leaned closer to Elena, voice dropping, but still loud enough for the room to catch pieces of it. "You're going to learn something today," he said. Elena's eyes stayed forward. Her breathing stayed measured. She didn't plead. She didn't glare. She didn't even look at him like he mattered. That was the problem. That was why he couldn't stop. Because Elena Cross was not giving him the one thing he needed to complete the performance. Failure. And the longer she refused to fail, the more the room began to sense what was really happening. This wasn't a lesson anymore. It was a man trying to win against quietness. And quietness, standing there on the mat, wasn't even fighting back. Yet. The first people to notice were not the loud ones. They were the older petty officers standing near the back of the circle. The ones who had been in long enough to stop clapping for speeches and start watching hands, feet, and breathing instead. One of them tilted his head slightly. Another shifted his stance. Not because Elena looked scared. Not because she looked weak. Because she didn't look like a beginner. Her feet were not squared up like someone bracing for impact. They were offset. One slightly forward. Weight centered. Heels light. It was a stance meant for movement, not survival. A petty officer near the edge of the circle glanced down at her hands. They weren't clenched. They weren't hanging loose either. They were relaxed, but alive. Fingers curved just enough to close instantly. Not the hands of someone hoping not to get hit. The hands of someone waiting for timing. No one said anything. They just started watching more carefully. While Lieutenant Harlan kept talking. While Elena kept slipping inches. While the room stayed quiet. And in the doorway, half hidden by the shadow of the hall, Master Chief Daniel Rourke stopped walking. He had not come to the gym looking for a show. He had been cutting through the building on his way to meet an instructor about scheduling conflicts. Noise had drawn his attention. Raised voices always did, not because of drama. Because raised voices often meant discipline problems. Rourke stood still. He didn't announce himself. He didn't interrupt. He folded his arms loosely and watched. At first glance, he saw what everyone else saw. A lieutenant performing. A quiet petty officer being used as an example. But Rourke had spent decades around men and women who did violence for a living. He knew what panic looked like. He knew what bravado looked like. And he knew what control looked like. Elena Cross did not look panicked. She did not look brave in the theatrical sense either. She looked organized. Rourke's eyes dropped to her feet. They weren't drifting. They weren't shifting randomly. They were adjusting in tiny increments, always in relation to Harlan's hips. Not his shoulders, not his hands. His center of mass. Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. Most beginners track fists. Most intermediates track shoulders. People who had been trained properly learned to watch the engine, not the exhaust. Rourke lifted his gaze to Elena's chest. Her breathing was slow, even. Not shallow, not spiking. Not holding. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. A rhythm that stayed the same even as Harlan's tempo increased. That kind of breathing did not come from courage. It came from repetition. Rourke's eyes narrowed a fraction. He watched her face. No flinch. No anticipation tension. No about to be hit. Expression. Only focus. Like she was solving something. Lieutenant Harlan stepped in closer. His weight shifted forward. Elena adjusted. Not by stepping back. Not by leaning away. She rotated her lead foot 3 inches, turned her hip slightly. Reset her balance. It was subtle. Most of the room missed it. Rourke did not. That wasn't fear. That was preloading. That was preparation. One of the older petty officers beside Rourke swallowed hard. He leaned a fraction toward another and whispered, barely audible, "You seeing this?" The other didn't answer. He just nodded once. Rourke kept watching. Something else caught his eye. When Elena shifted her arm slightly, the cuff of her sleeve rode up just enough to expose a sliver of skin. Not much. Just a corner. Just a shape. A tiny trident outline. So faded it almost looked like a smudge. Almost invisible. Almost. Rourke felt a quiet click in the back of his mind. He did not react. He did not step forward. He did not change his posture. But something in his eyes changed. Not shock. Recognition. The kind that comes with long memory. Lieutenant Harlan continued talking, continued posturing, continued trying to manufacture a moment where Elena would finally look small. But the longer it went, the stranger the scene became to the people who were actually watching. Because Elena Cross wasn't surviving, she wasn't enduring. She was managing. Like a person standing inside a problem they already understood. No one had labeled her yet. No one had said anything out loud. No record had been pulled. No rank had been revealed. But a quiet, uncomfortable question had started to spread through a few minds in that circle. What if the person being used as the example wasn't the student? What if she was something else entirely? The room didn't know the answer. It only knew that something about this situation didn't fit the story Lieutenant Harlan was trying to tell, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to pretend otherwise. The mystery remained intact, but the doubt had arrived. And doubt, once born, never stays small. Lieutenant Mark Harlan could feel the room turning on him. Not openly, not yet. No one was brave enough to challenge an officer in public, but the air had changed. The silence was different now. It wasn't respectful silence. It was the kind of silence that asks questions. Harlan threw another mock strike and pulled it at the last second. His palm cut through empty air with a sharp snap. Nobody laughed. He tried again, faster, sharper, like speed would bring the entertainment back. Still nothing. A few sailors weren't even watching his hands anymore. They were watching Elena. Watching her feet. Watching her breathing. Watching the calm that refused to crack. Harlan's throat tightened. He forced a smile, but it looked wrong on his face. Too tight. Too practiced. "This is what happens," he said loudly, voice carrying more strain than confidence now, when people mistake training for reality. He tightened his grip on Elena's wrist again. Harder. He leaned in so the circle could see his control. "You all want to be comfortable," he continued. "You want the world to be fair. You want rules." He looked around the circle like he was preaching. Out there, there are no rules. Out there, your enemy doesn't care about your feelings. His eyes returned to Elena. And out there, somebody like this gets killed in the first minute. The words landed ugly. The room didn't cheer them. The room just absorbed them. Harlan felt the lack of reaction like a slap, so he decided to create a reaction. He took a half-step closer, invading Elena's space until the edge of his uniform nearly brushed her shoulder. "We're going to add realism," he announced. It sounded like instruction. It wasn't. It was permission given to himself to go too far. A petty officer near the back frowned, then looked away like he didn't want to be part of what was coming next. Rourke, still in the doorway, didn't move. His face stayed calm, but his eyes sharpened. Elena stood exactly the same, breathing steady. Hands relaxed, eyes forward. The calm was still there, but it wasn't passive anymore. It was watchful. Harlan raised his free hand again. He threw one more mock strike. Pulled it at the last second. Then another. Then another. His movements grew tighter, harsher, like he was trying to force fear into her body through proximity alone. Elena slipped inches. No counter. No reaction. No performance. Harlan's mouth tightened. He glanced around the circle, searching again for laughter. He found a few sailors staring at him with something that looked uncomfortably close to disappointment. That did it. His ego hit a wall and started to crumble, and when ego crumbles under an audience, it often turns violent. Harlan's hand lifted again. This time, he didn't pause. He didn't telegraph. He didn't pull. The open palm came in hard and flat, a sudden, brutal slap across Elena's face. It landed directly across her nasal bridge. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. A loud crack that cut through the humid air and bounced off the walls. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The gym went so silent you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. You could hear someone's breath catch in their throat. You could hear the soft squeak of a boot as a sailor unconsciously shifted his weight. Elena's head barely moved. It turned only a fraction, like the strike had met a foundation instead of a face. Her shoulders stayed level. Her posture didn't collapse. Her knees didn't buckle. Blood didn't spray. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just a clean, hard hit and a woman who absorbed it like a fact. There was a thin sound of breath leaving her nose. A slow exhale. Then stillness. 1 second. That pause was everything. It wasn't shock. It wasn't processing pain. It was decision. And in that single second, Lieutenant Harlan realized he had done something he could not take back. Because the room wasn't laughing anymore. The room wasn't even watching him the way it had been before. The room was watching Elena. Waiting. Wondering. And Elena Cross finally moved. Her wrist rotated subtly inside his grip, not yanking away, not panicking. She turned her arm as if she were unlocking something, slipping bone and tendon into the one angle where a tight hand becomes useless. Harlan's fingers lost leverage. Before he could adjust, Elena broke his grip. Not by ripping free. By stripping the control away. Her hand came up and touched his forearm in a way that looked almost gentle. 2 fingers pressed into a precise spot. A nerve point. Harlan's arm went numb instantly, his hand opening without permission. His eyes widened, not in pain, but in surprise. Elena didn't back away. She slid forward. Inside his center line. Close enough that he couldn't throw power anymore. Close enough that his reach became a disadvantage. Her shoulder brushed his chest. Her hip turned, not wide. Not dramatic. A clean pivot that placed her weight under his balance. Harlan tried to step back. He couldn't. Elena was already there. Already occupying the space he needed to escape. Her leg hooked behind his in a way most of the room didn't understand until it was too late. The movement was quiet. Efficient, like a lever being pulled. Like a door being closed. Harlan's body lifted. Not high, just enough for gravity to become her partner. Then he was driven down onto the mat. Hard. Controlled, but absolute. The impact rattled the room. Harlan's breath blasted out of him in a harsh, helpless sound. Elena followed him down without hesitation. Her knee pinned his upper arm. Her weight settled on his shoulder line. Her hand captured his wrist and angled it just enough that his whole body froze, not because she was crushing him, because she had placed him in a position where movement meant injury. His face turned toward the mat. His cheek pressed against rubber, his eyes wide, staring at nothing. For the first time since he'd stepped into the center of that circle, Lieutenant Mark Harlan looked small. The entire exchange took about 2 seconds. Maybe less. Too fast for anyone to call it luck. Too clean for anyone to call it instinct. That was the terrifying thing about it. It looked practiced. It looked like something Elena had done before, under different lights, in different rooms, with consequences that weren't just embarrassment. Elena didn't say a word. She didn't glare down at him. She didn't whisper a threat. She didn't smirk. Her face remained calm, almost blank, as if she had just completed a routine task the way she completed supply forms and inventory sheets. Finished work. Harlan tried to speak. No sound came out. His pride had nowhere to go. His authority had evaporated. His body couldn't move. The circle of sailors stood frozen. Some had their mouths slightly open. One petty officer stared at Elena like he was seeing a ghost. Another looked away, then looked back, as if his brain couldn't accept what his eyes had just recorded. A sailor near the front took a half step back without realizing he'd moved. No one laughed. No one clapped. No one cheered. Because this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was proof, raw and undeniable. The kind that doesn't ask permission to be believed. Master Chief Daniel Rourke stepped away from the doorway. The sound of his boots on the floor was the only thing moving in the room. Elena still held Harlan pinned. Not out of anger, not out of vengeance. Out of control, out of discipline. And in that silence, with an officer face down on the mat and a quiet petty officer standing over him like a fact the world couldn't ignore, the entire gym understood something all at once. Lieutenant Harlan had not just crossed a line. He had struck a person who belonged to a different world than his, and the consequences were about to arrive. Not in shouting, not in chaos, but in the cold, institutional weight of recognition. Because the most dangerous moment in a room like that isn't when someone gets hit. It's the moment after. When the wrong person stands up and you realize you never knew who they were at all. Master Chief Daniel Rourke stepped into the circle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He walked with the kind of calm that made people straighten their backs without realizing they were doing it. The sound of his boots against the mat felt louder than it should have. Elena still had Lieutenant Harlan pinned. Her posture hadn't changed. Her breathing hadn't changed. Rourke stopped a few feet from them. "Petty Officer Cross," he said evenly. Elena's eyes lifted to him. "Up." She released Harlan immediately. No hesitation. No extra pressure. No attitude. She stood, took one step back, and returned to the same neutral stance she had held all afternoon. Rourke didn't look at Harlan. Not once. "Lieutenant," he said calmly, "you will remain silent." Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it. Rourke's eyes moved to Elena's face. There was a thin line of blood just beginning to form beneath her nose. Not dramatic, not flowing. Just enough to tell the story of what had happened without words. Rourke studied her quietly. Not her rank tab. Not her name tape. Her eyes. There was no adrenaline glare. No triumph. No anger. Only control. The kind of control that came from long familiarity with worse moments than this one. Something in Rourke's expression shifted. Subtle. Almost invisible. Recognition doesn't always look like surprise. Sometimes it looks like confirmation. "Petty Officer Cross," he said again. Slower this time. "Yes, Master Chief," Elena replied. Her voice was steady. Not loud, not soft, just professional. May I see your record? The words landed softly, but the room felt them. A few sailors glanced at each other. Rourke turned his head slightly. Petty Officer Mills. A young sailor near the edge of the circle snapped to attention. Yes, Master Chief. Tablet. Mills moved quickly. He pulled the ruggedized tablet from his side pouch and held it out with both hands. Rourke took it. His thumb moved across the screen. Biometric prompt appeared. Rourke placed his thumb down. Another prompt. He entered a short code. The tablet processed. Nobody spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Rourke scrolled. Once. Twice. His shoulders squared. His jaw tightened. Not in anger. In gravity. He scrolled again. Then stopped. Rourke looked up from the screen. He looked at Elena Cross, then back to the tablet. Then back to Elena. Quietly, without ceremony, he spoke. Chief Operator Elena Cross. A ripple moved through the circle. Not gasps. Not shouts. More like a collective inhale. Rourke continued, voice level. Assigned Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He did not list qualifications. He did not describe missions. He did not explain anything. He didn't need to. The designation did all the talking. Rourke locked the tablet, handed it back to Mills. Then he looked at Elena again, and for the first time since he had entered the gym, the room could feel the shift. The quiet petty officer they thought they understood no longer existed. In her place stood someone from a world most of them would never see. And the weight of that realization settled over the mat like a physical presence. Identity had snapped into focus. Nothing else needed to be said. Master Chief Daniel Rourke turned fully toward Elena Cross. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The kind of motion that signaled intention before it signaled action. He straightened his spine, pulled his shoulders back, brought his heels together. The simple geometry of it registered in the minds of the sailors before their conscious thoughts could catch up. Rourke came to attention. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then his right hand rose. Sharp, precise. A perfect salute. The room did not gasp. It did not erupt. It didn't need to. The shock moved through the gym like an electrical surge traveling through water. A Master Chief. Saluting. A woman everyone in that circle had been quietly dismissing minutes earlier. Several sailors straightened without realizing they were doing it. One petty officer snapped to attention as if pulled by a string. Another unconsciously dropped his arms to his sides. The hierarchy of the room rewrote itself in silence. Rourke held the salute. His eyes stayed locked on Elena. "Thank you for the demonstration, Chief," he said. His voice was calm. Not performative, not loud. But it carried farther than any of Lieutenant Harlan's earlier speeches. The word demonstration landed differently now. What had started as an attempt at humiliation had been officially reframed into instruction, not by spin, by authority. Rourke lowered his hand. Then, without shifting his tone, he said, "I apologize for what occurred. Not for the inconvenience, not for the misunderstanding, for what occurred. Ownership. Institutional weight." He turned his head slightly. Corman, a sailor near the back, responded immediately. "Yes, Master Chief, check her nose." Elena did not move. She did not nod. She did not speak. She stood exactly as she had before any of this started. Neutral stance. Hands relaxed. Eyes forward. Rourke pulled a small device from his pocket. He didn't announce who he was calling. He didn't need to. "Captain Hale," he said quietly into the line. "I need you at the gym." Pause. "Yes, sir." He ended the call. Rourke finally turned his attention toward Lieutenant Harlan. Harlan was still on the mat, sitting awkwardly, one hand braced behind him, trying to reconstruct his dignity out of pieces. Rourke's expression did not change. "Lieutenant," he said, "stand up." Harlan hesitated. Not long. Just long enough for the room to see that hesitation existed at all. Then he stood. Rourke looked at two senior petty officers near the edge of the circle. "Escort the lieutenant to the administrative office," he said. No anger. No lecture. No raised voice. Two sailors stepped forward. They did not grab Harlan. They did not need to. Their presence was enough. Harlan glanced around the circle one last time. No one met his eyes. No one laughed. No one looked impressed. Whatever version of himself he had walked into that gym with no longer existed. He turned and walked between the two escorts. The circle parted for him, not respectfully, not mockingly, simply, like an obstacle being removed. When Harlan disappeared through the doors, the gym did not relax. If anything, the quiet deepened. All eyes drifted back to Elena. She hadn't shifted her weight, hadn't wiped the faint blood under her nose, hadn't looked around. She did not look like someone who had just won. She looked like someone waiting for further instruction. Rourke studied her for a moment. Then he came back to attention. Not as a repeat, not as a performance, as protocol. Elena Cross raised her right hand, returned the salute. Once. Clean. Perfect. No flourish, no extra beat. Two professionals acknowledging each other. That single motion carried more meaning than any speech could. It said, "You are seen, you are recognized. You are not alone in this institution." The salute dropped. Rourke gave a small nod. Not approval. Not praise. Acknowledgement. Around them, the sailors stood in a room that felt unfamiliar now, because the person they had assumed was at the bottom of the social ladder had just been publicly placed somewhere far beyond it. Authority had reversed, not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through one precise, undeniable gesture. And the gym would never feel the same again, because once you witness a lie collapse in silence, you never fully trust loud confidence the same way again. They had just watched the SEAL world correct a lieutenant, with one salute. A few days later, the base moved the way bases always move. Schedules filled. Drills continued. Paperwork stacked. On the surface, nothing looked different, but underneath, something had shifted. The combatives' schedule quietly changed. A new block appeared on the weekly training board. Leverage-based counters. No explanation. No story attached, just a title. Instructors taught variations of the same sequence Elena had used. Grip strip. Inside entry. Nerve disruption. Hip turn. Balance capture. They didn't mention names. They didn't need to. The move worked. And in places like this, effectiveness becomes tradition faster than any legend ever could. Someone, somewhere, took a marker and drew a small, simple star in the corner of the mat where Lieutenant Harlan's shoulder had hit. Not big. Not dramatic. Easy to miss unless you knew where to look. People started calling it nothing official, just that spot. Every new class eventually trained near it. Nobody made speeches about it, but the older sailors paid attention. Lieutenant Mark Harlan did not return to the gym. Word moved the way word always moves on a base. He had been reassigned to an administrative billet. Paperwork. Staff coordination. A position that looked fine on a career sheet. A position that kept him far away from trainees. No announcement. No apology tour. No redemption arc. Just absence. Petty Officer Elena Cross went back to logistics. Back to supply runs. Back to inventory counts. Back to standing slightly off to the side of rooms. She didn't walk differently. Didn't carry herself like someone with a secret. Didn't gain new friends overnight. If anything, she became even quieter. One afternoon outside the gym, a young sailor lingered near the water fountain, clearly working up the courage to speak. Seaman Tyler Grant, barely out of his teens. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said. Elena stopped, turned slightly. "Yes?" He swallowed. "I was there." "The other day?" Elena nodded once. Grant hesitated. "They're saying, people are saying you're kind of legendary." Elena looked at him. Not harsh. Not amused. Just attentive. "It was a basic problem set," she said. Grant blinked. The way you did it." "Technique matters," Elena said calmly. He nodded, unsure. She added, "Assumptions get people killed." Grant didn't know what to say to that. Neither did most people when confronted with truth that simple. Elena gave a small nod. Then she walked away. No dramatic exit. No lingering. Just another quiet figure moving down a hallway. And that was the point. Some people leave behind statues. Some leave behind plaques. Others leave behind a change so subtle most will never trace it back to a single moment. The best professionals don't chase stories. They don't chase recognition. They don't need audiences. They focus on standards. They focus on discipline. They focus on doing the job correctly, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Because in the end, the most dangerous warrior in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to announce it. There are men and women across this country who will never appear in headlines. You will never know their names. You will never see their faces on recruitment posters. They move quietly. They work without applause. They carry discipline the way others carry pride. Stories like this aren't about humiliation or victory. They are about standards. They are about the kind of professionalism that doesn't need an audience to exist. They remind us that courage doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like a person standing still while being underestimated because they already know who they are. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more FOB veteran stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.